Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues everywhere and under any circumstances, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate a workforce that is engaged, stable, and diverse. Our podcast identifies the issues dominating the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? The Trump administration's course on immigration ushered in heightened standards for obtaining immigration benefits, restructuring visa allocations through executive orders, and renewed and continued emphasis on immigration enforcement. The 2020 election outcome will profoundly shape the ability of U.S. businesses to integrate immigration strategies into their financial plans and operations. This podcast will identify the areas of immigration law that will impact employers regardless of the outcome of the 2020 election. Our hosts today are Amy Guthett and Meredith Stewart. Amy is a principal in the Detroit, Michigan office of Jackson Lewis. She partners with clients to develop strategic and operational planning for employment-based immigration and corporate compliance. Meredith is a principal in the firm's Boston office, and her practice is dedicated exclusively to immigration and nationality law. Amy and Meredith, the question on everyone's mind today is, what's at stake for employers utilizing the U.S. immigration system, and how will their business be impacted?
Thanks, Alicia. Well, Amy Guthett and I are really excited to be here today. We work together in the Immigration Practice Group at Jackson Lewis. We have conducted some client pitches together and worked together on a number of projects. We're recording this on October 13th, 2020. Things are changing daily in immigration. Amy? The talk of the hour is the new H-1 rule. There are, from what I understand, 2 rules that have just come out, or one's in a comment period. Can you fill us in on what these are about?
Yeah, so there's always activity in the world of immigration. And we had just last week 2 new rules that were separate, one out of the Immigration Service and one from Department of Labor, but kind of working in tandem. Labor's rule came out on Thursday, October 8th, and took effect immediately and essentially changed how Department of Labor is structuring prevailing wage requirements. And that has a significant impact on H-1B filings by employers, as well as the perm green card process. Employers have to meet certain wage requirements for these 2 immigration benefits. And we've seen now overnight a huge skyrocket in the base salary level. And this is going to really have a huge impact on a lot of companies in that now they have to look at how they're paying their certain foreign workers and whether or not they can even meet these new requirements. There's also a new rule from immigration that tightens up the H-1B program. And that rule is subject to a 60-day comment period, but it has some pretty scary provisions, I think, or pretty restrictive provisions, one of which is the redefinition of specialty occupation. So how do you think that would impact the clients that you work with, Meredith?
Well, I think in particular, we're really going to have to a close between the degree that the foreign national has and the position being offered by the employer. By close correlation, in the past, we could file computer-related occupation, for example, for somebody that maybe had an engineering degree that wasn't quite on point, but it was an engineering degree. From what we understand, that would not be the case with this new rule in effect. Another provision of this particular rule that my clients are concerned about are third-party work sites and people that they have working for customers, especially in the tech industry. These folks are going to be limited to 1-year H-1Bs going forward that are going to have to be continuously renewed with significant documentation. So this is quite a large burden for industries who do have employees going out to third-party client sites. I think that we're really going to have to keep an eye on how these provisions are implemented, and it'll be a lot harder to get H-1B petitions through the system.
I absolutely agree. I think that, the cost of doing business has just gone up for most employers that have any sort of immigration program. The other thing that really concerns me about that rule, I'd be interested to hear what you think of it too, is you've mentioned that we have to show a closer correlation between the actual position and the degree field of study. So a lot of IT positions, a lot of engineering positions, as you said, we might have a job that's, say, a software developer, but that the individual has an electronics engineering degree, which there are overlaps in those programs, but it seems that the rule isn't going to allow that anymore. I'm also concerned about the wording that a bachelor's degree is always required or will always be required, which is a little bit of a departure from what we have now, which is a bachelor's degree is the normal or typical requirement. So when we're talking about always, that's pretty absolute. That means that a job is never going to have a qualification less than that.
Right. And that's hard for a lot of our IT companies, especially for employees who have U.S. workers who have been with the company for a very long time, perhaps came into the company and don't have bachelor's degrees in that particular field, but yet they're a great asset to the company. So their skill level is measured in other ways besides their education. But in future requests for evidence, we may have to show that every person holding that job or does have at least a bachelor's degree in a particular field, which is not practical at all in the real world.
My goodness.
On that note, we do have colleagues in the field who are already busily preparing litigation to fight these two new rules that have been introduced. One, as we said, is still in the comment period, and one, the Department of Labor one, did go into effect last Thursday. So we are, waiting to see what happens with those, whether or not there'll be an injunction enjoining the relative agencies from implementing these further or not. But moving on, in other news, there's a lot going on in immigration. The pandemic has really had an effect on our clients in other ways too, just travel restrictions and visa bans and overseas at the consulates. Amy, in your practice, what have you noticed regarding the travel bans and travel restrictions? How has this affected your employer clients?
Well, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, the impact was more minimal because everyone was kind of, sheltering in place and just trying to figure out what is it that we're going through. Something that we've never seen before on any level. But as states started to reopen, operations started to kind of, slowly claw back to normal, these travel restrictions have a huge impact on business. There's multiple layers of them. We've got the visa bans. So, for certain work visa categories, the visas are just simply not available for the rest of the year for certain people, as well as their family members. And that's problematic for companies that in particular for multinational managers and other specialized intra-company transferees, it's essentially limited employers' ability to get talent over to the U.S. to help revive business operations, right? We're all trying to recover and we need to be able to do that with the best possible talent and resources. And the inability to get some of these visas, at least through the end of the year, is really causing a problem. We're also seeing just the impact on basic business travel, right? With some of the COVID-based bans that aren't necessarily tied to particular visa categories, they're more so tied to countries and destinations that, we've got, lots of senior folks and even just project specialists that kind of need to visit colleagues in other locations. And it's not possible because of the limitations in coming back.
Yeah, I know in our practice, so there are certain exemptions that can be applied for even in the H or L context overseas with the consulate to try to get people in for visa appointments. For example, we had an L, he's the CEO of a global organization, and he needed to get his L1A visa to come to the United States. Now, we were able to obtain a visa appointment for him, but I think a big issue that we all struggle with is the inconsistency across the board with the consulates overseas, and hard to gauge, what is going to be accepted as a national interest exemption argument or not. And then also, as you mentioned, Amy, this Schengen ban has been very disruptive. Europeans in particular who are used to be freely coming back and forth. So even if they do have a visa that's valid in their passport, we have to email ahead to Customs and Border Protection at the airport in the United States to get them permission to fly into a U.S. airport. So all these extra things have been significant for our clients in just trying to manage, what is a global economy is very challenging. No, and then I think you alluded to this as well, as just the operational constraints at the consulates overseas too. They have limited staffing. I mean, the Department of State has had its own issues with personnel in certain countries and not wanting to put these U.S. citizens at jeopardy who are adjudicating visas, for example. So they're all at limited staffing. So it makes, adds to the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that we've kind of struggled with in all of these travel restrictions is just the complete inconsistent application. So just from practical experience or practical examples, getting waivers out of the U.S. consulate in Frankfurt in Germany seems to be very streamlined and very efficient, but yet that's not true in other countries. We've also had scenarios where we have to go to CBP, as you mentioned, and we've been asked by the officer, well, why did this person travel in the first place? Were they traveling because they missed their family, or they wanted to see, the Alps in the fall and look at the color changes? Or was it really a legitimate business need? And we've had pushback from Customs when the travel is for something other than business or a personal family emergency, where they're saying, well, you didn't need to take this trip, so why should we give you an exception and allow you to come back, before you've had that mandatory sit-out period? So it's really hard to give good advice to clients and help them plan, because to a large extent, we just don't know what the government's going to do.
Beyond the challenges that we're dealing with travel and so forth, I think the question on a lot of people's minds is, is this the situation going to continue? Should the current administration remain in power, or would this change if a new administration should be elected? And there's several kind of points, that we've been looking at to try to understand this better. Amy, do you want to, kind of take a couple of them initially, and then I can jump in?
Sure. The sort of broad answer to everything is, as we say so often in immigration, it depends. It just depends. So, the president has a pretty clear immigration platform and has been pretty vocal about his views on what U.S. immigration programs should look like. And, probably the most widely known is, of course, the wall, which is often sort of the backbone of any immigration discussion within the administration. So looking at tightening up border security through building a wall, the Trump administration would continue those efforts. As we've seen with the travel restrictions and now tightening up the H-1B rules and prevailing wage requirements, I think the administration, in terms of employment-based immigration, is looking to impose some wider limitations with the intention of ensuring that qualified top U.S. citizen workers have job opportunities, and that employers are not looking to fill their highly skilled positions with foreign workers, but looking to the U.S. workforce first. And I think that's the intention behind some of these programs that have come out somewhat restrictive.
Let me ask you, Amy, though, do you think that would necessarily change that part about the H-1B rule and all that if the Biden administration were to be elected?
At this point in time, I don't. I think that the rule would likely remain in place for some time. So Joe Biden has indicated in response to this new H-1B rule that he would likely leave that rule in effect. He probably would review it to see if there's any areas that maybe need some revision, but he is also very much in favor of ensuring that U.S. talent has first access to these high-skilled jobs. And I think that's what everyone is really looking for. So, the issue that we as immigration lawyers, I think, are trying to grapple with is that the top U.S. talent isn't always available, or any U.S. talent in some occupations and some regions. And so that's where employers are looking to supplement with foreign workers. One thing that's interesting is proposing, should he be elected, is creating a new visa category category that would essentially be available for cities and states to sponsor foreign workers to work in areas where they just have a need. There's just a lack of people or lack of skills. So that's interesting. And that's come up in the past. And I'd be interested to see if Biden did get elected, if there would be any progress on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that is a good aspect of what, he may be proposing is these underserved areas who do need certain talent. U.S. workers perhaps are not readily available or willing to go to these locations. But if it would mean the ability of a foreign national to get a visa, for example, that may, inject some real talent to those needed areas. So I think that's a great point. As far as the other aspects of their differences, I think, we've all heard the Trump administration talk about chain migration in the family-based context. So there's been talk of ending this. This would be U.S. citizen children, for example, trying to sponsor parents who are abroad to bring them here to the United States. The current administration has said that they would like to put an end to that, whereas the Biden administration instead has not, and also has introduced a pathway to citizenship for approximately 11 million immigrants that currently do not have status. So they've, as opposed to kind of a wide brush approach, eliminating kind of without putting forward a plan, the current administration kind of wants to eliminate any undocumented immigrants. But these people, some of them have been in the country for years and years. So I think it's important to have some way for them to regularize their status and become on the radar, so to speak. That's a really good point and difference, too. Yeah, of course, there's the diversity lottery that the current administration would like to put an end to. That's kind of like a lottery system every year where people are selected based on quotas in any given country that's represented, and whereas the Biden administration would like to preserve that system.
And I think it's important to point out, too, that Trump and Biden are not totally different on immigration either. We often spend time talking about differences, right? But they do have some overlapping ideologies, really. And I think for us at least in the employment-based immigration arena, I think the big one is, push to remove per country limits on those immigrant visa quotas and go to some sort of merit-based system. So it's while they definitely have difference of opinions in a lot of areas, there are still some similarities there in what they both believe or their belief system as far as immigration goes.
Yeah, and I think particularly, as you mentioned, in the employment-based categories or the employment-based realm, their differences really are not so great.
Yeah, I would agree. It's more so, and I think the other areas, they kind of fall really on party lines in terms of, where they stand with respect to some of those more humanitarian-based immigration issues. But you're absolutely right. From an employment-based context, they're not that far apart from each other. Maybe their tactics are different. The communication style is obviously different, but, the underlying goal with both of them seems to be, protect the U.S. worker and make sure that any immigration program we have in place is fair and administered efficiently.
Yeah, another thing that's a big part of my practice is enforcement with immigration customs enforcement, ICE. So, the current administration, we've seen, a strong emphasis on enforcement and removal really of individuals with any violation, whereas the Biden administration is more of removal of foreign nationals with criminal records and not taking such a hard stance perhaps on those with other just immigration related violations. But neither one of them wants to eliminate ICE, for example, altogether.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important point. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is regardless of the election, right? So, and I shouldn't say that. If Biden is elected over Trump, I think what's important for people to remember and for employers to remember that, we're not going to see on day one just sort of a broad overturn or a broad overturning of all of the immigration policies and programs that Trump has implemented. There have been very few regulatory changes, right? Most of these changes have been kind of at the policy level, kind of at the field level, as opposed to real meaningful legislative legislative change, and that will still require congressional support. So even if Biden is elected and has plans to make changes to some of these immigration programs, in many cases, he is going to need congressional support. And I think that's why President Trump has utilized agency memos and as I said, changes at kind of the policy level to get around the fact that Congress really hasn't passed any massive immigration change or reform package in years and years and years. It's a hard thing to get through. With a new administration, we may see some changes. I would expect to see changes, but it will take some time for that to happen.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed our discussion today, Amy, and I'm sure a lot more is coming down the road as far as new developments.
We will find out in a couple weeks what is going to happen with the election, and we will certainly have much more to talk about in the world of immigration, depending on who wins and when we find out who wins.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune into our next program, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, or to subscribe to our podcast, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.